the old American West, when the stars stretched farther than the roads, and the only thing faster than a stagecoach was gossip, staying warm at night wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival. Picture it. You're in a one-room homestead somewhere in the Dakota Territory. The walls are made of sod, which, for the unfamiliar, is a polite way of saying dirt and grass. The roof leaks when it rains, squeaks when the wind howls, and occasionally plays host to a family of raccoons more punctual than any rooster. Electricity hasn't arrived, because Thomas Edison is still fiddling with filaments, and the only thing glowing after sundown is your fireplace and your grandpa's opinions. To stay warm, people had to get creative. Coziness by necessity, you might say. Fireplaces, of course, were first on the roster, but not the grand marble monuments to warmth you see in modern catalogues. More like smoky brick holes that doubled as a chimney and tripled as a smoke signal to let the neighbors know, yes, you were still alive. And yes, dinner was once again burnt beans. Wood-fed stoves became the real MVPs of the 19th century West. The pot-bellied stove, short, squat, and somehow always making a polite ticking noise, was the focal point of many frontier homes and saloons. It sat there in the middle of the room, glowing gently, equal parts appliance and therapist. It warmed your toes, it dried your socks, it eavesdropped on arguments and card games alike. Now, keeping that stove going all night without setting your house ablaze was a delicate art. Folks would bank the fire before bed, heaping ashes over the embers to slow their burn, like tucking in a toddler who likes to set things on fire. If all went according to plan, the next morning you'd wake up to find the embers still smouldering, ready to be coaxed back to life with a bit of kindling and some heartfelt muttering. But not everyone had the luxury of a toasty iron stove. Some, settlers, especially the more nomadic types, cowboys, hunters, and the occasional extremely confused poet, made do with the fire outside. They'd pile up buffalo chips, a lovely euphemism for dried buffalo dung, and burn them with pride and perhaps a touch of desperation. Efficient, cheap, and always plentiful. Buffalo chips were everything firewood could be, except less romantic and slightly more fragrant. And inside the bedroom, if you could call 4 walls and a roof a bedroom, staying warm became a whole-body sport. People slept fully clothed, with their boots by their sides, hats on their heads, and sometimes a rifle tucked nearby, just in case someone decided to misinterpret hospitality after dark. Blankets weren't just made, they were earned. Heavy wool, hand-quilted patchwork, or, for the luckier souls, a thick Hudson's Bay blanket purchased at a trading post in exchange for what seemed like the better half of your pantry. These were blankets that weighed more than a toddler and smelled both heroic and slightly of mutton. You didn't sleep under them so much as anchor yourself beneath them. And then, of course, there were the human furnaces, otherwise known as family members. Whole families would pile into one bed, not from lack of space, but from lack of insulation. Mothers, fathers, children, and occasionally small dogs who'd earned their spot, all curled together like a stack of flapjacks left slightly ajar. Heat was shared, awkward limbs were forgiven, and snores became lullabies. There's a dreamy resilience to that type of survival, isn't there? When the night pressed in through the walls and the cold whispered at the seams of your boots, you held each other close, told stories into the dark, and relied on the steady crackle of burning logs or the slight smolder of buffalo innocence to carry you through to morning. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, let your eyes get just a little heavier, and we'll gently wander deeper into the lantern-lit lives of those long-ago nights. In the soft creak of rough-hewn timber and the low moan of prairie winds dancing past shuttered windows, the American frontier family prepared for the long, cold nights with the delicate precision of a bedtime ritual. And possibly just a touch more soot under the fingernails. You see, long before thermostats blinked with smug digital accuracy, warmth was an earnest pursuit and, frankly, a part-time job. In the Wild West, surviving the night in January wasn't just a matter of pulling the covers tighter. It was a matter of what you burned, where you burned it, and whether you still had eyebrows come morning. Take, for instance, the classic wood-burning stove, the undisputed iron monarch of frontier living rooms. Roughly, the size and temperament of a small bear, the stove was both protector and hazard. At night, it radiated the kind of heat that could roast a person's shins while leaving their nose frostbitten. Families would gather round, circling the stove like pilgrims orbiting a sleepy volcano, one eye on the dancing flames and the other on the cat, whose job it was to detect any rogue sparks with borderline supernatural instinct. Chopping wood for the stove wasn't merely household maintenance, it was Western cardio. Children small enough to be confused for kindling themselves were handed axes with questionable wisdom and sent out to split logs until they could no longer feel their fingers or their grievances. Pine, cedar, oak, each had its own burn habits, aroma, and crackle personality. Cottonwood, for example, burned about as enthusiastically as a soggy biscuit and was selected only in absolute desperation or as firewood prank. And then there were buffalo chips, dried buffalo dung for the unacquainted, which, if you're lucky, includes you. To this day remains one of the stranger alliances between man and ungulate. With forests in short supply across the vast plains, pioneers turned to what nature offered in abundance, the rear-end leftovers of the American bison. Once dried to an honest crisp, buffalo chips burned surprisingly well, with a scent somewhere between campfire and confession. Children were often tasked with collecting them, turning every family walk into either a fuel-gathering expedition or a very questionable treasure hunt. Despite what the movies suggest, most Wild West dwellings were not luxurious log cabins glowing with cozy amber light. Some were sod houses, earth-packed, mud-roofed rectangles that looked less like homes and more like the ambitious nesting site of a determined mole. Still, what these soddies lacked in glamour, they made up for in insulation. Buried half in the ground and surrounded by thick sod walls, they held heat with all the stubbornness of a badger refusing to leave a barn. But warmth wasn't just about heating materials, it was about technique. Beds weren't just piles of ticking and fluff. Oh no, savvy sleepers pre-warmed them with heated stones pulled from the stove and wrapped carefully in cloth. These primitive bed warmers were then slipped between sheets an hour before bedtime, transforming the mattress from icy tundra to sleep sanctuary, albeit briefly, and with the ever-present chance of a burned toe. And when it came to clothing, the rule was simple. If you could wear it, and it didn't visibly smoke, it counted as pajamas. Layers were worn like armor, sometimes not changed for weeks, a blissful fact made only bearable by the equally musty scent of everyone else. Toes were bundled in wool, hands tucked beneath quilted patchwork covers, and hats. Oh, hats. Hats stayed on indoors, in bed, and often in dreams. A person wasn't properly dressed to sleep until their head was wrapped like a sentient squash. As the family finally drifted to sleep beneath patchwork quilts, hand-stitched with patience and gossip, the faint glow of stove light flickered across rough walls. Outside, a coyote howled a question to the moon, all pointed nose and lonesome echo, and inside, someone snored in reply. Sleep on the frontier might have been cold, creaky, and occasionally flammable, but it was hard-won, and under the right quilt, deeply comforting. Tomorrow would bring more wood to chop, more chips to collect, and perhaps, if fortune smiled, a tale or two exchanged over coffee, brewed strong enough to unwrinkle bark. But for now, listen to the crackle, lean into the warmth, and if your toes begin to thaw, you're doing it right. Now, speaking of coffee, tomorrow morning's warmth starts long before the cup. Let's drift toward the fire-lit secret of frontier breakfasts. Out on the open prairie, where the stars spill across the night sky like spilled sugar and the wind whispers through the grass with all the secrets of time. Warmth wasn't a convenience. It was a matter of cleverness, trial and error, and sometimes a touch of stubbornness that could only be mustered by someone who thought buttons were suspiciously fancy. To the cowboys, pioneers, and those brave or bewildered enough to settle the American West before the buzzing dance of electricity arrived, staying warm at night was less about pressing a thermostat and more about an epic battle between man, nature, and the rather untrustworthy insulation properties of hay. Let's start with what you slept on. Featherbeds. Absolutely. If you were a plump banker in a big city with a housekeeper named Hattie. Out west, however, bedding often consisted of what was modestly called a tick, a cloth sack stuffed with, well, whatever was available. Straw, for one. Corn husks, if they hadn't already been needed for smoking pipes or other multi-purpose homesteader rituals. Perhaps wool, if your sheep were agreeable. Anything softish and willing to stay inside a bag qualified. These ticks were piled atop wooden bed frames, or in leaner cabins, right on the dirt, tucked in like a sleepy potato in a makeshift oven. Blankets were an art form of survival. If you were lucky, or traded well, you might have a real wool Hudson Bay blanket, thick and resplendent with bold stripes, the likes of which were worth their weight in bread and dignity. Wool was the West's gold standard for keeping warm, breathable, moisture-resistant, and slightly itchy enough to remind you that comfort was a modern illusion. Add to the pile a few buffalo hides, a sackcloth or two, and possibly your coat, hat, and whatever dog you could persuade to share body heat. Quite possibly, you were a burrito of necessity. In sod houses, those dirt and grass bunkers pioneers built with all the architectural flourish of a mole on a deadline, there was a curious warmth. Not luxurious warmth, mind you, but a persistent, earthy coziness. Dug into the ground and walled with thick sod blocks, these homes insulated against the relentless plains wind the way a potato insulates its filling. The walls might sweat slightly in spring, host a few cheerful insects in summer, and smell like reluctant compost in fall. But come winter, they had a charm that could best be described as "you're not freezing." Wood stoves and fireplaces, of course, were lifelines. Small cast iron stoves, often affectionately named after catalogue descriptions like Model 8 Temperance Stove with Warming Shelf, stood bravely in the centre of cabins, feasting all night on dried-out sticks, animal dung, or whatever burnable substance could be politely convinced to go up in smoke. The stove was both heater and hearth, warming bodies, boiling beans, and drying out socks that steamed gently like disapproving ghosts. But oh, You had to babysit these stoves, let them die out in the night, and the cold would pounce, sneaking in, through chinks and gaps with all the subtlety of a prankster raccoon. And then there were the more creative methods. Ladies might heat up bricks in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them at the foot of the bed. These homemade foot warmers work surprisingly well, unless, of course, someone forgot a brick in the bed and met it with a tender shin in the middle of the night, leading to a series of words not often printed in church bulletins. In more sociable settings, saloons, boarding houses, or the rare luxury of a frontier hotel, people simply slept next to each other like spoons in a drawer, ranking from friends to absolute strangers to one very drunk prospector with hat hair and a fondness for spooning anyone warm. And let's not forget the role of livestock. Some pioneers, particularly those whose architectural intentions exceeded their resources, shared one-room dwellings with chickens, goats, and even the occasional cow. Not merely pets. Oh no, these animals were thermostats with legs. Chickens under the bed gave off heat like feathery water bottles. A cow in the corner helped raise the room's temperature and provided gentle nightly mooing, which, depending on your personality, was either deeply comforting or a cause for existential reflection. Comfortable, maybe not. Creative, undoubtedly. The West may not have had radiators, but it had resourcefulness, a little manure, and a lot of tenacity wrapped in wool. And just when the fire burned low and the frost tapped politely on the window pane, there came the question of pajamas, or more often, the lack thereof, which leads us gently into stories of nightshirts, long johns, and the age-old debate: how many days can one garment be worn before it reaches sentience? If you slept in a sod house in the prairies in the 1870s, you might wake to find a small, curious lizard sleeping on your blanket, a thin crust of frost in your boots, and one side of your face pleasantly toasted by the iron stove, while the other remained firmly in conversation with the freezing night. Early Western settlers weren't exactly coddled by comfort, but they did get creative. And so, we arrive at the curious business of bed warmers. Now, let's imagine it. A frontier husband tiptoes into a bedroom built mostly of ambition and chilled drafts. His wife, already tucked under a hand-stitched quilt that weighs as much as a stubborn pony, eyes him skeptically from beneath bonnet-shaped hair. The man, wielding what looks like a shallow brass pan, with a lid and a stick attached, begins performing the sacred nightly ritual, the warming of the bed. Bed warmers were like poor man's sunshine, or rich man's compromise. You take hot coals from the fire, dump them carefully into the lidded pan, usually copper or brass, then slide it gently under the covers to warm the sheets, the mattress, and ideally not ignite the entire mattress into a patriotic blaze of homespun flame. This maneuver demanded some finesse. Shake it too vigorously, and you risked rolling molten coal into the danger zone of Victorian undergarments. Not vigorous enough, and you'd end up with a sheet that's hot in one spot and an enthusiastic icebox in the next. The Western pioneers didn't just need courage and grit. They needed evenly distributed warmth. Of course, not everyone could afford a store-bought bed warmer. More resourceful types made do with bricks. Yes, bricks. Warmed near a fire and then wrapped in fabric or stuffed in old stockings. There's something tender about the idea of a worn-out sock snugly hugging a hot brick, gently cradled at the foot of the bed, like a sleepy rabbit that radiates thermal love. And then there were soapstones, those heavy grey minerals capable of holding heat like secrets. A well-heated chunk of soapstone, often snuck under a plaid blanket, could stay warm for hours. Some families even name theirs. Yes, Terry, the soapstone. Even with bed warmers though, comfort was relative. You still had to share your bed with a sibling, or three, or a slumbering uncle who smelled permanently of smoked bacon and pipe ash. The family mattress might be stuffed with corn husks, or if you were lucky, goose feathers. Although actual geese rarely consented to the transaction. If you had an iron stove, the Cadillac of frontier heating, you positioned it dangerously close to your bed, danced the choreography of midnight stoking, and lived in thrilling suspense over whether sparks might one day mischievously try to join you beneath the covers. Of course, all this fuss served the same humble purpose, keeping humans consistently less frozen than the environment intended. Sleep itself was a winter strategy. People didn't just go to bed at night. They surrendered to it early, sometimes not long after sundown, because once your one good lantern was snuffed and your feet had gone numb, it made more sense to pile every warm body, blanket, and sleepy dog into bed and simply hope to wake up without frost on your teeth. Yes, dogs too had a role. Canine furnace units, known as 3-dog nights when it was so cold. You needed all 3 dogs in bed to not turn into a historical statistic. There's something comforting about how universal our need for warmth is, and how endlessly inventive we've been about solving it, even when technology amounted to a hot rock wrapped in last year's sewing project. Each tool, each trick, each slightly scorched quilt tells a whispered story of human imagination meeting the nightly chill. And as the pioneers slowly drifted into dreams, faces lit by the dim amber glow of crackling coals or sleepy candles, the warmth wasn't just in the bed. It was in the effort, in the hands that baked the brick, struck the matches, shared the blanket, or left the dog an extra biscuit. Now, imagine the fire dying down, little embers blinking like sleepy eyes across a log. The wind outside nudges the cabin, walls, unsure whether to howl or hush. And indoors, a shared breath of heat, a rustle of wool, a squeaky yawn from a serious-looking child in thermal underpants. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't luxurious, but in the quiet, flickering darkness of a western night, it was enough. And just beyond that warmth, nestled deep within the folds of a now slightly toasted blanket, is another secret of frontier slumber, one wrapped in buffalo hide, birch bark, and perhaps a touch of cinnamon. If you were a cowpoke on the American frontier in the 1870s, snuggled up in a drafty log shack, or splayed out under a tarpaulin of stars, you quickly learned that warmth wasn't just a creature comfort. It was a form of survival, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and becoming a very sleepy snowman. Long before thermostats and triple-pane windows, the Wild West had to get creative. And by creative, I mean alarmingly flammable. Take, for instance, the pioneer invention known, enchantingly, as the bed warmer. Ignore the romantic sound of that term. It wasn't a friendly Labrador or a cuddle partner named Hank. Oh no. It was usually a metal pan filled with hot embers placed under the bed covers before jumping in. Imagine the thrill of toasting your toes on something that, moments earlier, looked suspiciously like a portable forge. You'd think pioneers were all pyromaniacs with quilts. Of course, bed warmers weren't universal. Out in the lonesome territories, heat was sometimes acquired the old-fashioned way, sharing body warmth. Families often piled into the same bed, squeezed together like books on a sagging shelf. Privacy. That was a 20th century luxury. Back then, your younger brother drooling on your shoulder was just part of staying unfrostbitten. Cabins weren't exactly paragons of insulation either. Walls were chinked with mud and hope. Floors were often dirt, actual literal dirt, and windows, if you were fancy, maybe animal hide, stretched over a wooden frame. More commonly, windows were the first place the wind rang its winter hymns. To combat the cold, many practiced what can only be described as layering with intention. Wool was prized, itchy, scratchy, overachieving wool. You didn't undress for bed so much as rearrange your layers slightly. One settler wrote in her diary that she wore so many woolen petticoats to bed. She feared she might reappear come spring as a sentient sheep. Sometimes, warmth came with a scent. Cow dung, specifically. Out in the plains, where trees were scarce and winters long, buffalo or cow chips were a commonly used fuel. Dried and fired up in the hearth, these humble patties burned just long enough to warm a skillet and the soles around it. The nose got used to it, or it gave up. Speaking of burning things that probably shouldn't be burned, let us not forget about grease lamps. These were open flame lamps fueled by fat. Animal fat, to be specific. Just as delightful as it sounds. The next time your power goes out and you light a scented soy candle, take a moment to appreciate that you aren't relying on raccoon tallow harvested from your own backyard. Townsfolk had their own tricks for staying toasty. Saloons, interestingly, doubled as communal warming spots. After kicking back a shot or two of whiskey, not for the children of course, although frontier logic could be flexible, patrons might linger by the cast iron stove. The only thing heated faster than the stove was the gossip. Did you hear Abigail Jenkins is knitting mittens out of porcupine fur? That's either resourceful or a cry for help. Hard to say. There were also the curious inventions from local tinsmiths and backyard geniuses. There's record of one gentleman who allegedly designed a long, winding stovepipe that snaked through every room of his modest cabin, distributing heat evenly, until one especially cold night the soot in the pipe ignited, transforming the home into something resembling a holiday sparkler. Still, even with embers under beds, burning livestock deposits, and highly questionable home engineering, many found the cold to be oddly comforting. With the wind howling outside like a homesick ghost, and a pot of beans simmering over the fire, families told stories, sang old songs, and wrapped themselves in patchwork quilts stitched from worn-out clothes and fond memories alike. And if the warmth came slow and the wind crept in through the slats, that just made you hold each other closer, breathe a little deeper, and be profoundly thankful for the small miracle of warm toes in a wild land. Tonight, we've only scratched the surface of frontier warmth, but as we gently drift into quieter corners of the past, let us now step outside these humble log walls and take a little walk. Out to where the prairie meets the barn. There, in the dark and snow-drifted night, we'll light our way with a lantern and meet the animals who, like their human neighbors, had their own curious dances with the cold. In the still hush of a prairie evening, where the wind whispered lullabies through the wooden slats of drafty shacks, keeping warm wasn't so much about comfort, it was about survival. And survival, as it turned out, could be rather creative. You see, the folks of the Wild West weren't just pioneers of cattle wrangling and questionable mustaches. They were heat hackers, thermal tacticians, waging nightly war against the bitter cold with little more than stubbornness, ingenuity, and an enduring belief that quilts could solve most of life's problems. Among their arsenal of warming devices, one rather unglamorous hero deserves a quiet round of applause: the humble hot brick. Yes, it may lack the prestige of a roaring hearth or the drama of a blizzard-battered saloon, but to a frostbitten cowboy, a brick heated in the coals of a fireplace was a precious treasure. Wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath layers of patchwork, these slow-releasing bundles of warmth turned frigid bunkhouse beds into toasty retreats that could almost convince you sleep was possible. But for those who feared dropping a smouldering brick onto their flammable bedding, there was an alternative, one that involved livestock, chickens to be precise. Farmers, ever economical, sometimes allowed a hen or two to roost indoors at night. Not only did the birds add a surprisingly efficient touch of warmth, but their gentle cooing and feather puffing lent a certain pastoral coziness. Of course, there was always the risk of rogue droppings and the occasional rogue cluck at 3 a.m., but sacrifices had to be made. Moving up the livestock scale, there was also the time-honored tradition of cow cuddling, though perhaps not in the way modern therapists suggest. In barns and sod homes, people would sleep in lofts above their animals. Not for sentimental reasons, no. Cows and horses gave off heat like living fireplaces with hooves, raising the ambient temperature of the room by several critical degrees. And if you ignored the aroma of damp hay and barnyard perfume, it really wasn't the worst arrangement. For those seeking warmth without the help of livestock or baked masonry, there was always the bed warmer, an object that sounds innocent enough, but would have exploded most fire safety codes of today. These were shallow metal pans, filled with hot coals and slid between the sheets just before bed, a sort of primitive electric blanket, only glowing red and somewhat prone to igniting things. To be fair, people took precautions. The pans were kept moving to avoid scorching the linens. Some folks even developed a stirring technique, circular motions, gliding from foot to pillow. The 1878 Bedford Spiral, they called it. Well, no one actually called it that, but perhaps they should have. Meanwhile, in the rougher corners of the frontier, warmth came in the form of body heat, and not just the romantic kind. Bunkhouses often held half a dozen or more people, lined up like thermally efficient sardines, grumbling under shared quilts. You didn't have to like your bunkmate. You just had to be willing to lie very, very still next to him, preferably after he'd removed his spurs. Arguments frequently broke out over missing blankets, wandering elbows, and, more famously, who got to sleep closest to the stove. Ah, yes, the stove. If ever there was a dictator of domestic life in the Wild West, it was this cast iron colossus. Everything revolved around it. Meals were cooked on it. Clothes dried around it. Pets napped perilously close to it. And each evening, before the lights were never turned off, because there were none, someone was assigned the most important duty of the night, stoking it just enough to last until dawn, but not so much that the cabin resembled a smelter. Despite all these strategies, freezing fingers and chilled toes were unavoidable companions. Socks, often hand-knitted, served as spiritual comfort even when they were technically more whole than fabric. And still, there was a certain poetry in the perseverance. Evenings filled with quiet pipe smoke, kettle steam, and soft creaking wood. All humans huddled together against the endless cold, tracing shadows by firelight and dreaming of spring. And when even the stove's final embers faded and the last warm brick began to cool beneath the quilt, folks would pull their shawls tighter, listen to the wind rattle the windows, and remind themselves of one comforting truth. They'd get through the night, just like they'd get through the winter. One warm brick, one snoring bunkmate, one brave little chicken at a time. Now, if your toes haven't gone numb imagining all that, stay close, because soon we'll wander into the merciful warmth of frontier kitchens, where ingenuity cooked up more than stew. It cooked survival itself. While the sun slipped behind the buttes and the hush of dusk blanketed the prairie, warmth became less about comfort and more about existential necessity in the Wild West. A chilly evening breeze might have tickled the ears of a banker back east, but out here it could rearrange your nose. Naturally, cowboys, settlers, and saloon DJs, that is the piano man, had to get creative. By the time the stars blinked their approval overhead, most homesteads had already transformed into battalions of quilts, buffalo hides, and hay-stuffed ingenuity. And yes, hay. Wonderful, itchy, sneeze-inducing hay was not just for horses. It was stuffed inside mattresses, wedged into walls, and occasionally worn as a hat by toddlers looking to startle the neighbors' goats. You might imagine that folks huddled by the fireplace sipping brandy in front of elaborate stone mantles. But let us gently correct that image with the truth and a wink. Fireplaces in the West were seldom the charming brick kind you'd find in a Jane Austen novel. They were more often chiseled, rock structures that smoked up the room as effectively as they heated it. Many a Western diary includes a line suspiciously like, "Built a fire, set half the cabin on stuffy fire, coughed myself into tomorrow." Of course, wood was the go-to fuel, but out on the open range, trees were a luxury the wind had long spirited away. Enter the most underrated MVP of frontier heating, cow chips. That's right. Dried buffalo dung, respectfully called buffalo chips, was collected, stacked, and revered as nature's inconveniently fragrant heating puck. Pioneers swore by them. Little children gathered them like Easter eggs, only browner and slightly warmer. Cook stoves ran on them. Fires were fed with them. Frontier poetry no doubt rhymed about them. Roses are red, violets are blue, cow chips are dry, and heat dinner too. For those who had the means, cast iron stoves provided an upgrade to the open hearth inferno. A good iron stove was like a Victorian spaceship that delivered both hot biscuits and cleansing sweat. They were shipped by train or wagon in heavy, noisy pieces, and assembling one without yelling was considered an act of sainthood. Most families hovered around the stove like moths with chores. You dry your socks, warm your beans, toast your soul, all at once. Rooms far from the stove, however, became icy exhibits of pioneer suffering. That's where the bed warmer came in, a lovely piece of antique menace. Bed warmers were metal pans filled with hot coals, slipped under the covers before bedtime. In theory, they were delightful. In practice, they were small arson auditions. One slip, one long story told too close to the cider jug, and your sleep might be both warm and eventful. Meanwhile, in the bunkhouses of dusty cattle ranches, cowboys developed quite the affection for hot rocks. Large stones were heated in the fire, then carefully wrapped in burlap and tucked under blankets, turning your bunk into a modest Western sauna. Bravo, of course. One had to be awake enough to remember the burlap. Any cowboy who's forgotten that learned to sleep standing up until healed. And let us not forget perhaps the ultimate heating device of the era. Sheer, unapologetic snuggling. Families slept in proximity that would make a sardine blush. Siblings layered like lasagna, parents sleeping head to toe, and grandparents asserting that chilly feet built character. Guests, they either squeezed in or slept outside with the cow chips. That was the etiquette. Even the family dog, whether it was a noble shepherd or a confused prairie mutt named Biscuit, had a most honored position. Foot warmer. Sometimes, 2 dogs. On especially cold nights, 3 was considered lucky. This wasn't indulgence. It was survival with fur and tail wags. As the wind howled across the plains and stars glittered like watchful eyes, warmth in the west wasn't just a matter of temperature. It was a kind of stubborn communion, a patchwork of pots, rocks, pies, coals, and all the heated determination a person could muster. They didn't have thermostats, but they had wits. And occasionally fire-related incidents of note. And just as one learns the fine art of carefully navigating a bed filled with hay, blankets, and a possibly smouldering pan, there was another place, further west, higher up, where staying warm took on a whole other altitude. There, the mountain folk faced a different kind of cold, and an even older kind of comfort, stitched from snow and centuries. The wind on the prairie crooned like a mother hushing a baby. Across the swaying fields of buffalo grass, where stars stared down unblinking, a lone cabin might creak softly under its own weight, nestled into the scape like it was trying to pretend it wasn't cold. And make no mistake, it was cold. The sort of cold that snuck into your bones like it paid rent. And that, dear dreamer, is where we return, to the drowsy heart of the Wild West, a place where warmth wasn't just a luxury, it was a quiet obsession. By now, your imagination may have conjured a cowboy or two. Maybe they're drinking something hot by a flickering fire. But here's the thing, they probably weren't. Hot drinks took time, firewood, and often someone who remembered not to pack the coffee in the same satchel as the horseshoe nails. It sounds silly, but prairie logic didn't always prioritize convenience. Cup of cocoa, maybe if you were in a storybook. In reality, warmth started from the boots up. You see, your average cowboy was no fool. He wrapped his legs in wool chaps, not for fashion, but because biting winds didn't care how tough you were. Inside the long johns and flannel, layers were more important than looks. A single shirt under a coat could mean shivers till sunrise. But add a wool undershirt, a flannel overshirt, maybe a vest, and then a slicker. Now you were ready for the nightly freeze vest. But even the cleverest layering couldn't cheat the cold all night. And so we arrive at one of the crown jewels of frontier coziness, the bedroll. Ah yes, the beloved bedroll. Not quite a mattress, not quite a miracle, but certainly a frontier marvel. Like a burrito made of wool and desperation. Cowboys used canvas tarps to wrap up layers of blankets, usually made of horsehair or wool. And these rolls were as much about waterproofing as they were about preserving body heat. When unrolled, they offered the closest thing to a womb that an unshaven man on the range could fit into, with dignity slightly negotiable. These rolls were vital. On the trail, your bedroll was your bed, your shelter, your emotional support bundle, and occasionally your pillow if there were no rocks available. They radiated a sort of rebel comfort, scratchy, heavy, and smelling alarmingly like yesterday's stew. Speaking of stew, the evening fire wasn't just for cooking. Cowboys would sleep near fading coals for that extra blast of precious warmth, although the ambitious ones sometimes got a little too close and woke up with cooked boots. Nearby, someone would inevitably snore like a broken harmonica, while others lay perfectly motionless, believing that if they didn't stir, the cold wouldn't find them. Of course, if you were lucky enough to be in a cabin, or even luckier, a roadhouse, you might have access to a cast iron stove. Tall as a man and twice as temperamental, these stoves turned dried cow chips or chopped wood into glorious heat. But they had a personality. They groaned, they ticked, they sometimes spat sparks just to remind you they were absolutely in charge of your evening. To keep the heat going, Someone always had to wake up in the middle of the night and stoke the thing, tossing in another log while half sleeping in their socks. It was a noble task, undertaken not out of heroism, but because the person who didn't do it woke up with frozen pants. Nobody wants pants that crackle. And then there was the communal element of warmth. If you think bunking up with 5 or 6 other men in dubious hygiene conditions sounds unromantic, well, it was. But huddling together like grumpy penguins kept everyone alive through long winter nights where even the whiskey froze. And let's not forget quilts. These were hand-stitched, family lore-infused, riotously patterned layers of tenderness, sometimes featuring patches from old clothes or eerie stains with stories unspoken. A good quilt weighed as much as a tired toddler and offered the same inexplicable comfort. Under one of those, even the howling wind sounded like a lullaby. As the night stretched westward and sleep tightened around horseback drifters, prairie widows, and coughing miners alike, the science of staying warm transformed into ritual. Wrapping, layering, stoking, huddling. It was all a kind of quiet hopefulness, repeated night after night under lantern-shaped stars. And just when sleep began to slide its velvet shawl over the frontier, someone somewhere would mutter, "Ain't nothing colder than a saddle come morning." Which reminds me, there's a whole dream's worth of stories about how they manage those frigid dawn starts. But that weary traveller will wander into next. Somewhere between the last flicker of twilight and a coyote's 5th unsolicited lullaby, folks out west began turning their attention to bedtime. But not too quickly. There were still a few essential matters to see to before climbing beneath a woolen mountain of itchy blankets. Chief among them, the art of staying toasty without the luxury of flicking a switch, pressing a button, or grumbling dramatically at a smart thermostat. And so, welcome to the twilight hours of a typical night in a Wild West cabin, where warmth was a matter not of convenience, but rather of persistence, pragmatism, and, frankly, quite a bit of smoke inhalation. Now, the fireplace, the hearth, the old reliable heat giver. It wasn't just where you warmed your socks or dried your wet gloves. It was the throbbing heart of the room, and possibly the only reason your toes didn't rebel and march off during the Montana night. But keeping a fire going wasn't simply a matter of tossing in some logs and performing a hopeful dance. Wood had to be seasoned, left to dry for months, sometimes a year, because wet wood meant smoke, soot, and the smell of regret embedded in your clothes until the spring thaw. Folks developed something close to a sixth sense for firewood. A gentle tap on the log told them everything. Hollow thuds meant dry, ready to burn. Dull clunks. A long night of coughing and eye-watering misery. Not everyone had the luxury of round-the-clock fire duties, though. So came the practice of banked fires, a gentle little trick that allowed people to keep embers smouldering all night under ashes or a heavy log, essentially turning the hearth into a sleepy dragon, waiting to roar back to life at first light. This trick had a twin sibling in something called the foot warmer, a literal box, wooden, metal, or sometimes ceramic, filled with coals and carried like a pet heat source. You'd find these nestled at the bottom of a bed on the coldest nights, or sitting obediently between boots on the floor. They were the to-go cup of warmth in a world where warmth didn't travel easily. In towns lucky or unlucky enough to have stoves, there grew a kind of quiet reverence around them. Cast iron, intricate, often named things like Franklin or the Quebec Beauty. These stoves were both the pride of the parlor and the animating spirit of the room. You'd hear people humming lullabies to them, murmuring encouragement like, "Come on, girl, keep those biscuits rising. The problem, of course, was that iron heats up slow and cools down fast, so bedtime routines often included warming a flat iron or heated brick and tucking it into the sheets ahead of you. Think of it as the rudimentary ancestor of the electric blanket, though somewhat more likely to set your bed on fire if not handled lovingly. Out on the prairies, without so much as a tree to split in sight, buffalo chips, dried manure for the uninitiated, became the fuel of choice. Yes, it burned. Yes, it worked. And no, the house never smelled great, no matter what tall tales Grandpa spun about it over beans and cornbread. Blankets, too, played their role with stoic intensity. Handmade quilts told the story of your family while doubling as a fortress against hypothermia. They were layered in combinations known only to their wielders, the snug jigsaw of sleep defense, wool on the bottom, down above that, and a quilt so heavy it could pin a grown man's soul to the mattress. And yet, the real secret to surviving a February night wasn't just dry wood, coal boxes, or a particularly zealous bed quilt. It was body heat, which is why beds were rarely solo ventures, even platonically. Children, snuggled in with siblings, parents, or whoever happened to be the warmest mammal available. Some families even welcomed their chickens indoors for the night, in a sacred pact of mutual feathered warmth and potentially nightmarish pillow-side clucking. When all else failed, people just accepted that bedtime was less about comfort and more about hibernation. Close eyes, stack blankets. Promise yourself you'll chop twice as much wood tomorrow. And if, by some miracle, you woke up with all 10 toes, well, that was cause for genuine celebration. Now, with the last coals gently sighing beneath a steel plate and the snow hushing all movement outside, it's time to look beyond the cabin walls, to the wagons, the ranches, and the full-body thermal mysteries of what cowboys called bunkhouses, where warmth took on an entirely different personality. By the time the stars pricked open the velvet sky above the frontier, the prairie dogs had ducked into their burrows, the coyotes began to sing their night opera, and the humans, well, they huddled close to warmth, and not just the kind that crackled in a fireplace. No, to survive those unforgiving wild western nights, folks got creative, extremely creative. Imagine yourself inside a modest log cabin somewhere near Deadwood, South Dakota. The wind outside hisses like a snake with chilly intentions. The door's got a gap wide enough to swing a squirrel through, and every board of the walls speaks fluent breeze. Yet Grandma's crocheting another wool sock, like her life depends on it. Because the truth is, it just might. The primary way to stay warm at night, before electricity swept in with its seductively silent radiators and practical paranoia about exposed heating elements, was simply body heat. Good old-fashioned, human-emitted, snuggle-worthy warmth. Cue the great bed conundrum. Large families, scarce heating. You do the bunk math. Was it cozy or crowded? The answer is yes. It wasn't uncommon for parents and children, and occasionally neighbors, and perhaps one too many stray cats to pile into the same bed. Imagine being the youngest. Not only did you not pick the side, you didn't even get a corner. No, your destiny was the middle, where elbows and knees met nightly in an accidental family square dance under 10 pounds of itchy wool blankets. Historically accurate? Absolutely. Hygienically divine? Well, let's say the past had a different relationship with personal scent. Of course, for some, the bed was a luxury. Cowboys, sitting atop their horses longer than most of us sit in traffic, didn't tuck in at night so much as flop over near their campfires and hope not to roll into the flames. In journals, they often mention how a saddle could substitute for a pillow, and a blanket made from buffalo hide helped hold the warmth long enough for a half-decent night's sleep, assuming the coyotes didn't get curious. But one of the more peculiar bedtime strategies of the Wild West, hot bricks, or if you were lucky, a soapstone. These were heated in the fire and then tucked into beds like toasty little foot companions. Think of them as 19th century bed warmers or prehistoric electric blankets with significantly more potential for third-degree burns. The real pro move was to wrap them in fabric beforehand, not because people knew much about thermal dynamics, but because ouch is a pretty good teacher. Then there were bed curtains. Ah yes, the four-poster bed wasn't merely an excuse for dramatic fainting in dime novels. Those hanging drapes served a purpose. They trapped the heat humans emitted during the night, creating a makeshift greenhouse effect where the crop was simply not freezing to death. For settlers who could afford such luxury, this was a tremendous upgrade from the hope and shiver method. Now, if you were especially resourceful and had access to livestock, say, in the form of a sturdy donkey named Elmer, you might keep your barn attached directly to your house. Why? Not because Elmer was lonely, but because his body heat could help warm the adjacent living quarters. This architectural style, called a house barn or connected farmstead, was common in cold regions. Just imagine dozing off as the sweet aroma of hay and gentle sounds of livestock breathing drifted through the walls. It was organic heating in every rustic sense of the term. And let us not forget the ultimate custodian of midwinter warmth, the feather tick. These thick, mattress-like quilts were stuffed with down feathers, often from geese who were not consulted about the arrangement. Heavy enough to flatten most ambitions and warm enough to make a bison sweat. These comforters were prized possessions in homesteads across the West. Did they occasionally release a feather or two mid-slumber, lodging in one's nostrils? Certainly. Was it worth it? Also certainly. People layered clothing like it was a sport. Flannel, undergarments, nightcaps to preserve what little head warmth the body produced, and the increasingly mysterious bed socks. In an era before central anything, unless you count central panic about whether the fire would go out, warmth wasn't just a preference, it was a priority, chased nightly through trial, error, and a truly shocking number of nightgowns. And so, wrapped up in quilts heavier than sin, beside family, livestock-adjacent walls, and the occasional baked brick foot warmer, our Wild West sleepers drifted off. Dreamers in a world before electricity flicked its magic switch. Let's tiptoe now to another kind of warmth, one that comes from conversation, company, and a peculiar leafy plant that helped frontier folk wind down after a long day. In the still hush of a prairie evening, where the horizon stretched so far it folded gently into itself, one could hear the crackle of boots by the fire, the creak of timber settling into old age, and, more uniquely, the rather determined squawk of a chicken that refused to sleep in its coop. Out here, warmth wasn't just a convenience. It was a negotiation between human wit and Mother Nature's rather brisk temperament. And in that frigid conversation, the humble bedwarmer played an unexpectedly elite role. Before central heat, before gas-fired stoves, with dials reading cozy and very cozy, folks in the Wild West relied on devices that were equal parts clever and mildly dangerous. Chief among these was the venerable bed warmer, a tool that resembles a cross between a pizza peel and a domestic threat. Made of metal with a long wooden handle, it was filled with hot coals, or better yet, heated stones, if one didn't fancy waking up on smouldering sheets, and then slipped ever so gingerly between the covers to warm the bed before climbing in. Now, one might think, coals under the blankets? Surely not. But oh yes, ranchers, traders, and toe-sensitive cowboys all placed their trust in what amounted to a portable ember tray. A warm foot was often worth the risk of a small, sheet-scorching mishap. Besides, sheets weren't exactly Egyptian cotton. If you were lucky, they were wool. If you were unlucky, they were also wool. Of course, not everyone had access to such refined tools. Out in the fur-trading cabins of Montana, or tucked among the gold dust dreams of California, ingenuity was currency. Soapstones, dense, heat-retaining rocks, were often thrown into the fire and then, with some towel-based theatrics, carried to the foot of the bed. Wrapped tightly in rags or socks past retirement age, the warm stone offered hours of gracious comfort, doing its best impression of modern-day heated blankets, albeit without the plug or warranty. For the particularly industrious, or perhaps just desperate, metal kettles filled with hot water served as makeshift radiators. Many a gold prospector curled around one like it was a sleeping kitten, whispering sweet nothings to the steam until dreams overtook him. There's no record of whether any of them ever named their kettles, but given the levels of isolation and affection involved, it's exceedingly likely. Across the plains, Native American tribes had long understood how to keep warm through high design rather than charred furniture. Carefully insulated teepees lined with bark, buffalo hides, and thick layers of earth and snow created surprisingly snug sleeping quarters. Stones heated by fire would sometimes be placed inside the shelter too. Functioning much like thermal batteries, the earth absorbed the heat, then returned it slowly over the cold hours. No wires, no smoke damage, just a quiet understanding of nature's materials honed over generations. Back in town, boarding houses and family homesteads might keep bricks in the stove all day, then wrap them in cloth and tuck them into beds before the nightly chill. A visitor from out east might write home to complain about sleeping with a brick where a good husband should be, but at least the brick didn't snore or steal the covers. And let us not forget the odd but charming practice of warming pigs. Yes, live pigs. Before you laugh or call for help, consider that on smaller farms, miniature pigs, ready-made waddling heat sources, were sometimes brought inside to snuggle up with children during the coldest months. Pigs are, as it happens, quite warm, quite cuddly, and perfectly willing companions provided you can overlook their conversational skills. There was a kind of warmth out west that had little to do with fire and everything to do with shared resourcefulness. People handed down tricks, like sewing extra lining into boots with old flour sacks, or using hay stuffed under a featherbed for extra loft. Even sleeping spoon style wasn't born from romantic whim, but from survival. The cold made pragmatists of everyone, and if a prairie winter wasn't enough to convince you, waking up with a frozen mustache certainly was. And so, night after night, the great game of Don't Freeze was played under stars bright enough to make even chilled bones pause in reverent admiration. With bricks, buckets, stones, and sometimes suspiciously quiet pigs, the people of the Wild West found ways not just to endure, but to outwit the evening air. And as the fire in the hearth sighs down to a whisper, and the stars lean in just a little closer, let's follow the flicker of light beyond the bedpost and into the gentle symphony of snores and simmering stew. There is something oddly poetic about a cast iron stove. It doesn't look like poetry, of course. more like a squat iron mushroom with a belly full of firewood and soot. But in the West, before the flick of a switch could change the temperature of a room, this awkward metal contraption was central to survival and storytelling. Perhaps that's why it often sat right in the middle of the room, like an honored guest at a social gathering. The cast iron stove was the heart of the frontier home, even if it had no heartbeat of its own. Once it got going, though, it pulsed with radiant heat that spread slowly but surely, like gossip in a small town. People huddled around it with mugs of something hot, coffee, sassafras tea, or whatever liquid courage they'd managed to concoct, and let their toes thaw while their backsides roasted. A child could sidle up too close and come away with a pantseat that had seen better days. But what's a little singeing among friends? Getting one of these beasts started was no simple task. Early risers, often the unfortunate youngest in the family, or anyone who sneezed too loudly during the morning silence, would shimmy out from under layers of buffalo hides, wool blankets, and tired dogs to face the morning freeze. They would rattle the stove's iron belly, reuse yesterday's embers if it had any left, and coax new flames from kindling with steady patience and lots of smoke. By the time others stirred awake, one corner of the cabin might be tolerably warm, while icicles still clung stubbornly to the inside of the windows. The stove also doubled as a slow cooker, sock dryer, boot dicer, and makeshift humidifier, if you didn't mind everything smelling faintly of burnt turnips and charred socks. Life demanded multitasking, and so did your heating source. Some stoves had a tiny oven or cooktop built in, bubbling with stews or biscuits while the fire roared beneath. If someone baked cornbread in January, the whole cabin smelled like optimism. Children knew to keep their sides to the warmth and rotate gently, like meat on a spit. Too long in one position and you'd overcook. Dogs claimed the warmest patch right next to the legs. Cats occupied the stove lid itself if the lid was closed, and sometimes if it wasn't, which is how many a feline learned about humility through a singed whisker or two. Now, it's worth appreciating the strategy behind where a stove went. Ideally, it stuck close to the center of the house, if you had something as luxurious as separate rooms. The idea was to wring every last wisp of warmth out of every inch of radiating iron. Drafty walls and rattling window panes did their best to undo your efforts, but frontier folk were nothing if not persistent. They stuffed mouse-chewed gaps with rags. They wore knit caps to bed, and when all else failed, they curled into each other like spoons in a drawer. Of course, the stove had its own form of frontier drama. If your chimney wasn't built quite right, it could backdraft smoke faster than a lying poker player pushing his luck. Insides blackened, eyes watered. Nevertheless, no one left the room. It was still warmer than anywhere else. There were rules, unspoken social norms regarding your place near the stove. The older you were, the closer you got. Visitors earned a side seat, but not the coveted front row unless they brought stories or whiskey. Children tiptoed in the periphery, waiting for an opening, or pretended to fall asleep next to it until someone gave up their spot out of kindness or exhaustion. All around the flickering stove, the quiet comfort of warmth and whispers took hold. Tales of cattle drives, ghost sightings, and narrowly avoided frostbite were passed around like a tin cup of strong tea. In a world without central heating, there wasn't just warmth here. There was humanity, flickering like flame through the seams of the old iron stove. And so, while the wind howled outside like a coyote composing its first opera, and snowflakes pressed soft kisses on wood-shuttered windows, The humble stove held back the cold, one glowing ember at a time. Some nights, when the stars blinked behind gauzy clouds and dreams clung to the rafters, the stove was all that stood between comfort and cold chaos. That warm, ticking sentinel kept watch, and it never needed to sleep. Which brings us, quite naturally, to an even cozier character, wool, and the mystery of how a sheep's haircut could tuck you in better than a lullaby. The cold plains of Nebraska could crack a pine knot in January, the saying went. And for once, nobody was exaggerating. Towns like North Platte, broken out of the prairie like a biscuit from a pan, faced winters that could freeze a moustache mid-whistle. But settlers on the western frontier weren't particularly inclined to freeze, moustache or otherwise. They had ways, ingenious, sleepy, and occasionally a little smokier than entirely advisable. Let us lean in now, past the frost-bitten windows and creaking barn doors, to one of the simplest solutions to winter's bite: body heat. Now, it might not sound like much technology, being warm just by virtue of being human, but in the Wild West, that was Plan A through about Plan E. Pioneers would pile into bed like spoons in a drawer, particularly children, not just to conserve warmth, but also to conserve firewood, space, and, perhaps most importantly, sanity. Imagine 9 children racing around a one-room sod house. Now imagine them asleep. It's like someone threw a warm, peaceful blanket over the entire known universe. In many families, parents and children shared beds, which was practical, albeit slightly crowded. Quilts were layered like geological strata. Flannel, wool, perhaps a faded patchwork stitched by candlelight, and the occasional cat, whose warmth to size ratio was unmatched. Dogs sometimes helped too, usually uninvited, but not forcibly evicted either. Now, before anyone gets too sentimental about all this closeness, let it be known that one restless sleeper could undo hours of thermal planning. A well-aimed elbow, a foot released from the covers, suddenly someone's dreaming of Kansas in July just for the heat. But for the most part, it worked, and everyone woke up, not to comfort necessarily, but to not being an ice sculpture, which was the primary goal. Communal heat wasn't just a family affair either. In some frontier towns, boarding houses would offer long communal beds where strangers drifted to sleep side by side like logs in a flume. Polite society mostly pretended this wasn't awkward, and exhausted people, having wrangled cattle or stitched 10 coats in a day, cared very little about the etiquette of snoring. And of course, there was the bed itself. Modern mattresses, for all their whispery NASA foam and cooling gel wizardry, can't quite compete with a good old-fashioned feather bed for rustic weight and womb-like insulation. These beds weren't just warm, they were situations. Fluffy, sagging islands you sank into like a gently haunted marsh, where dreams lingered and mornings took their time turning up. A curious frontier invention in this category was the warming pan. This was a metal pan, usually brass or copper, filled with embers and slid between the sheets like a sleepy cousin of the pizza box. You had to be quick. One did not linger with live coals in bed, but effective it was. Practical, cozy, and slightly terrifying. Some preferred a brick warmed by the fire and wrapped in cloth, a red-hot placeholder of sorts. This method was notably less likely to set your nightgown ablaze and offered decent returns in toe-thawing bliss. These bricks were reused nightly, becoming almost family heirlooms, if a bit sooty. Now, fuel, you'll recall, was precious. Too precious to waste burning through the night. So fires were often banked, that is, covered in ash before bed, to preserve embers until morning. a well-banked fire could smolder like a secret, waiting patiently until dawn to leap back to life with the coaxing of kindling and coffee rituals. Farmers and homesteaders knew the art of wrapping homes in warmth from the inside out. Rugs were laid along walls and floors, not just for decoration or to hide suspicious stains, but to trap cold air like misbehaving mice. Curtains were stuffed into window cracks. Even newspapers served as insulation, finally giving the local cow auction listings a second life pressed between logs and settlers. And somewhere among these survival strategies, there were the little things: wool socks by the stove, a hot mug pressed between hands, the smell of something stewing gently overnight. These were the soft luxuries of a life wrapped in self-reliance. In old letters, settlers wrote not of luxury, but of contentment. A warm bed, a roof that didn't leak, and a morning where the coffee didn't freeze in the pot. Each a tiny triumph. Comfort dragged from the wild with calloused fingers and stitched into quilts that held not just warmth, but stories and songs and the hum of lived-in silence. And as the wind howls on the other side of the log walls, blowing over the prairie like a mist train, we drift into the quiet center of the night, where warmth is a shared achievement, just enough to bring sleep stretching in on, tiptoe. Now, with your toes tucked in and the firebank glowing faintly, let's see where our journey carries us next. While many imagine the Wild West as a place of constant shootouts and dramatic train robberies, a significant portion of frontier life was far less cinematic and much, much colder. When the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the prairie wind began to whisper its icy secrets, the heroes of the American West weren't polishing six-shooters. They were layering socks. Let's set the scene. A modest log cabin in the middle of nowhere, Montana territory. Inside, the fire sputters in a stone hearth, a pot of beans achieves a noble simmer, and two tired ranchers are engaged in a passionate debate about who has the colder feet. In those days, arguments over chili recipes and strategic blanket hoarding carried emotional weight comparable to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In an era before electricity, central heating, or even the modern soup spoon, keeping warm at night was something of a full-body, full-brain commitment. And although the term thermal underwear hadn't entered the national vocabulary yet, ingenuity was alive and well. Folks pulled inspiration from the animal kingdom, specifically anything with a lot of fur and very little regard for personal space. Buffalo robes, for example, were the designer comforters of the day. Heavy, unruly, and capable of making any bed resemble a stampede, these massive hides were both blanket and security system. It's awfully hard to run off into the night when your bedding weighs more than you do. If you were fortunate or well connected, you might snag one of these precious pelts at a trading post, likely for the price of a decent horse, 2 chickens, and any remaining illusions about minimalist living. Many pioneers relied on featherbeds, essentially fabric sacks filled with goose down that swaddled sleepers in soft, sneezy comfort. Featherbeds were so beloved that travelers reportedly carried them westward in wagons, taking up valuable cargo space that could have been used for food or family members. But frostbite was democracy's great equalizer, so priorities stayed in place. Of course, humans weren't the only ones participating in these nocturnal warmth strategies. In colder climates, it was entirely normal for families to share cramped beds, not only with their children, but with the family dog, the barn cat, and occasionally, an emotionally fulfilled chicken. Country wisdom held that a 3-dog night wasn't a pop band, but a measure of temperature, the kind of night so frigid it required 3 dogs to keep from becoming a pioneer popsicle. Speaking of unconventional heating methods, let's discuss the unsung heroes of the old homestead: bricks and potatoes. Before bedtime, folks would toss a few bricks into the hearth or bury them in the coals. Once toasty, these handy thermal batteries were wrapped in wool and tucked under bed covers or even into boots. A baked potato, similarly treated, could do double duty, warming feet and providing breakfast if someone didn't roll over too enthusiastically in the middle of the night. Nowhere was the layering tactic taken more seriously than in the realm of nightclothes. Long johns, made of scratchy wool and endless optimism, were worn with pride. Worn under nightgowns, under shawls, under heavy quilts, these garments formed a delightful Russian nesting doll of personal insulation. There's even record of folks sleeping in their daytime clothes to save heat, effort, and decisions. Fashion, after all, was seasonal at best and hypothetical at worst. And then there were bed curtains. If you've ever wanted your sleep space to double as a miniature stagecoach, bed curtains provided both luxury and insulation. The wealthy, or at least modestly warm, could sleep in four-poster beds draped in fabric, trapping heat and occasionally small rodents. Candles and oil lamps would be extinguished early to conserve fuel, plunging cabins into a darkness so complete it made bumping into furniture a nightly ritual. And yet, in those long, silent hours between dusk and dawn, there was a kind of peace, a hush that settled over the snowbanks and through the floorboards as the fire crackled and the wind howled, and the homemade quilt rose and fell to the slow rhythm of human breathing. People relied on each other in those nights. Families huddled together not just for comfort, but survival. There was a sweetness in that closeness, a gratitude for small warmths, a mug of cider, a hand-me-down shawl, the pure bliss of discovering a warm spot in the mattress left by someone else's elbow. As the cabin's walls grew frosty and the moon cast silver shadows on the prairie, someone might murmur about tomorrow's chores: wood to chop, soup to stir, cow to convince that yes, standing still really was a better idea. But those thoughts would melt with the fire's glow. Somewhere deep in that dreamy warmth, minds would drift, not toward outlaws or gold rushes, but toward lessons in survival whispered by wind and wool. And as we drift gently toward our next sleepy frontier, we'll discover how early inns and saloons transformed into more than just watering holes, becoming the flickering hearths of an entire traveling nation. As the hour grew late and the prairie night settled over the American West like an old patchwork quilt, homes flickered with the tired amber of lantern light and the slow burn of last embers. If you ever wondered how folks without anything fancier than candle wax and frontier grit kept from becoming human popsicles each winter, well, welcome to the underappreciated world of sleeping arrangements, Wild West style. Let's begin in the humble log cabin, often built with enthusiastic optimism and a highly questionable blueprint, which may or may not have been designed by a man named Earl who once saw a house from 200 yards away. Early pioneers had a particular talent for stuffing entire families into what was essentially a glorified wooden box slightly larger than a modern shed. And when the mercury dropped, and it did, with all the elegance of an anvil, those cozy quarters filled up faster than $1 whiskey saloon on payday. In these cabins, staying warm at night was less about insulation and more about strategic human layering. Families would sleep packed together like spoons in a drawer. Older children were tucked in beside younger ones. Grandparents often claimed the spot nearest the fire, and someone, usually whoever had lost a dice game or had the weakest elbows had to sleep by the door, which was less private entryway and more a glorified wind tunnel. But here's the clever part. Lining beds with hot stones, heated in the fire and wrapped in fabric or tucked into iron pots. These frontier foot warmers were the unsung heroes of many a frostbitten winter. Typically placed at the foot of the bed, they offered just enough heat to prevent one's toes from falling off in the night. If that sounds quaint, it was. Until you accidentally touched one with bare skin and had to explain the branding iron-shaped scar for the rest of your natural life. Meanwhile, on the more mobile side of things, wagon trains rolling westward often provided their own brand of nocturnal ingenuity. Pioneering families on the trail didn't have walls to hold in heat, but they did have buffalo robes, thick, heavy, often slightly pungent, and a general acceptance that you'd be sleeping next to at least one other person radiating both warmth and mild odors in equal measure. Beds were often straw-stuffed sacks laid directly on the ground or inside the wagon itself, if you were lucky, and not currently using it for, say, 6 children and 2 barrels of flour. A popular saying went, if your water bucket's frozen, your nose won't be far behind. That's not just poetic. That was meteorological truth with a blanket over it. Then, of course, there was the cowhands remedy, whiskey and denial. Cowboys rarely had the luxury of cabins or even tents. Out on the open range, they slept in bedrolls, also called cowboy cocoons, lined with wool blankets, and occasionally dreams of warmer choices in life. Their philosophy was simple. Layer up, roll tight, and ignore the frost forming on your moustache. Cattle rustling wasn't the only thing that clanked in the night. Sometimes it was just the sound of a flask hitting a bedroll, and if you were lucky, you'd wake up not too damp, not too cold, and still in possession of all your extremities. The townsfolk, meanwhile, had their own answer to night chills. Potbelly stoves. These bulbous cast iron fixtures sat cheerily in the center of homes, schools, and saloons like small, grumpy space heaters from the 1800s. They belched out heat, smoke, and occasionally a shower of ember. Flakes if someone got too enthusiastic with the poker. People would strategically position their beds, or at least their feet, toward the stove like sleepy sunflowers following a coal-fueled sun. But even with all this ingenuity, warmth didn't always come from fire or fabric. It came from people. From huddled, snoring family piles, quilted crowds snuggling through blizzards, and long, silent watches beneath a chilly sky peppered with stars unbothered by the cold. Even in the dust and difficulty of frontier life, there was always warmth to be shared, be it from a buffalo skin or from someone pressing their icy toes into your side just as you were drifting off, whispering sweet nothings like, "My feet are freezing, scoot over." Now, while most beds of the West were tucked in by stars and stitched together with pluck and pragmatism, there was one more place where night meant something else entirely, where walls were made of canvas, flickering shadows told stories, and warmth was more than a matter of survival. It was performance. But that, as it happens, takes us along a fresh trail, toward the traveling tents and vaudevillian comforts of another spirited frontier haunt. There's something strangely poetic about waking in the dead of night to the purring crackle of a dwindling fire and the faint sound of a coyote opera in the distance, especially when you're tucked beneath a mound of scratchy wool, beside a window that's letting in more frigid air than it's keeping out. Such was the nightly experience of many Wild West settlers who found themselves bunking down in sod houses, log cabins, or, for the more ambitious, oddly drafty Victorian homes on the prairie. And in those long hours between sunset and sunrise, when the sun couldn't be counted on and the fire had given its best, our ancestors devised an entire arsenal of heat-hoarding inventions. But few were as dearly beloved or as questionably hygienic as the bed warmer. Now, if you're picturing something quaint and cozy, like an early electric blanket, oh no, this is the Wild West we're talking about. Imagine instead a long-handled metal pan, an oversized frying pan with a lid. This was filled not with a hearty stew or a reluctant egg, but with glowing embers scooped right from the fireplace. The whole contraption was then slid underneath the bed covers to warm the sheets. It did the job beautifully, unless you forgot it down there for too long, in which case your bed would be warm right up until the moment the mattress caught fire. Sleep tight. Slightly safer was the hot brick method, adored by economical frontier folk who didn't fancy turning their bed into a barbecue. Bricks were warmed on the hearth and then wrapped in flannel, old socks, or if you were truly blessed, an unwanted gift of hand-knit wool. These were tucked in at the foot of the bed, a quaint little foot sauna for the weary Western soul. For the more elite sleepers of the frontier, the ones who had things like walls not made of mud or wheat paste, earthenware foot warmers were an indulgence that had shape, form, and even flair. These little ceramic charmers, often with handles and embossed decorations, were warmed by hot coals or hot water and smuggled into bed like contraband, stylish and marginally less likely to ignite. But sleeping warm wasn't simply a matter of popping a toasty object in the sheets. No, it was a whole ritual. First, one must don bedclothes. Not to be confused with regular pajamas, bedclothes were more like intergenerational armor against the cold. Think flannel nightshirts long enough to trip over, layered wool stockings, and a nightcap that resembled a collapsed pastry. Some folks even slept with their boots on in the winter, which sounds outrageous until you've tried putting on frozen leather at 5 a.m. with frostbitten fingers and a rooster watching you silently judge. Villagers and lone cowpokes alike also knew the value of sleeping in herds. Entire families would bunk together beneath a single heap of quilts, each layer made of whatever fabric could be spared or stolen from old curtains, canoe sails, or distant memories of fashion. Parents, children, and possibly a confused neighbor or two might be nestled together, sourcing warmth with the tenacity of penguins during a blizzard. Feet were tucked under the dog, if there was one. If not, some kindly branded cow might be invited in, depending on how rural you truly were and how many guests you expected for breakfast. And of course, let us not forget the romance of the co-sleeper, a strategic assignation where warmth and companionship went hand in mitten. The communal bed was, in many ways, the original social media platform. You learned all of Catherine's gossip between snores and Cousin Emil's political opinions, whether you liked it or not. Everyone emerged with a little residual heat and a great deal of shared personal information. As is for those still brave enough to sleep solo on the silent frontier, there was always the buffalo robe, large, thick, and heavier than a troubled conscience. These hides were prized not only for their ability to insulate, but also for their knack at deflecting nightmarish drafts through log cracks and questionable door frames. You couldn't roll over very well, but you were essentially sleeping inside an armored tank made of fluff and former bison. Now, under that vast uninsulated sky, with stars blinking coldly above and the floor creaking like an old sea captain's back, people curled inward, toward fire, toward warmth, toward each other. And though the wind outside insisted on composing a wintry symphony with every chimney and shingle, the human spirit tucked itself in tighter, stoked the fire, and whispered to the dark, "Not tonight, Jack Frost." I wore 2 layers of long johns and hot bricked the footboard. And so, as the fire dims and the stories fade into ash and shadow, let us follow those calico dreams westward still, where warmth, whether shared, smuggled, or stolen from bricks, found its way into the sleeper's heart, perhaps just in time for something a little different by lamplight. As night descended on the vast open frontier, the Wild West slipped not into silence, but into a different kind of hum, the kind that mingled the whinny of distant horses with the creak of windmill vanes, and the occasional clack of Grandma's knitting needles, attacking wool like it owed her money. Inside a dusty homestead, the hearth glowed like a sleepy eye, the only source of light and warmth in a room crowded with cast iron, wooden furniture, and people with extremely specific opinions about cornbread recipes. While many things were rugged out west, land, law, facial hair, the art of staying warm at night was a delicate dance between ingenuity, stoicism, and the liberal use of animal hides. One method involved what can only be described as pre-industrial sandwiching, not the kind with bread, the kind with humans. In families where privacy was more legend than reality, everyone piled into the same bed. Parents tucked in with children, uncles, the occasional second cousin visiting for a night or two that somehow turned into a fiscal quarter, and Granny asleep in the rocking chair like some kind of wool-knitted gargoyle. These human burritos were insulated further with layers of quilts, buffalo hides, and sometimes, much to the dismay of light sleepers, cats. Plural. You see, cats were more than pets. They were economic co-workers, mouser in residence, lap heater, early warning system for barn mice, and at night, they distributed themselves expertly among feet, stomachs, and the tops of heads, purring warmth into available crevices like living, autonomous boiler systems. But for those brave or unlucky enough to sleep alone in the one-room cabin world, there existed the trusted hot brick trick. Before bed, a brick would be heated gently in the fireplace until it reached the temperature of an especially annoyed sunburn. Then, wrapped in flannel or wool, it was tucked into bed like a secret weapon of coziness. By morning, it would be cold and a little tragic, like a leftover baked potato you forgot about. Not everyone had the luxury of a fireplace, though. Some frontier folk made do with potbelly stoves, marvels of cast iron engineering that could heat a room, boil coffee, and sear a man's shin all in one fell swoop. With their compact bellies and little pipe chimneys, these stoves were the heartbeat of many cabins, warming toes, beans, and conversations. Of course, there were hiccups. Sometimes the fire went out in the middle of the night, thanks to an over-eager chicken brushing past the tinder pile, or a raccoon, with what historians would call a high tolerance for risk. Waking in the icy dark, someone, usually the one with the fewest excuses, would have to rouse themselves from beneath the quilt mountain, trudge barefoot toward the embers, and attempt that perilous business of relighting something flammable without relighting themselves. This was also the era of what early Americans called bed warmers, which were elegant brass pans filled with hot coals, slid into bedsheets ahead of time to banish the freezing ghost of cold linen. The key to using one effectively was keeping the pan constantly moving. Otherwise, you'd go from warming the bed to branding it, or yourself, or in one notorious case recorded in an 1872 journal from Ohio, burning an exact map of the county into the mattress. Even more handmade were the warming stones of the Apache and Navajo. river rocks heated by fire and then wrapped in animal skin or cloth to provide personal warmth during bitter desert nights. A simple comfort, as old as the night sky itself. Frontier folks also had an enigmatic way of viewing sleepwear. Men wore long flannel nightshirts that looked suspiciously like they'd borrowed their wife's laundry. Women bundled up in layers, as if reenacting the slow-motion collapse of a rag heap. And during particularly frigid nights, no one debated fashion. Everyone simply dressed in all the clothes they owned, and possibly the neighbors too, if he was slow locking his drying line. The real secret though, the one your textbook never bothered mentioning, was that warmth in the Wild West came less from logs or bricks or brass pans and more from the unspoken understanding that the frontier didn't just build towns, it built togetherness. People shared warmth, not because they had to, but because that's what you do. When the wind howls through the prairie like an angry harmonica player, and your only insulation is the laugh of a sibling or the sigh of a sleeping ox in the barn. Some nights, the cold was fierce and the fire too small, but someone always got up, stoked the embers, added a log, and returned unseen to their place beneath the covers. And that's how warmth worked back then, quietly, like kindness. Just ahead, we'll amble into the night air and meet an unsung hero of post-sunset survival, the untouchable mystique of the frontier nightcap on a moon-washed prairie night, with coyotes howling somewhere miles off in the chilly distance. The people of the Wild West turned to an unlikely hero in their battle against the cold, the humble bed warmer. Now, before you picture something wildly mechanical or vaguely ominous, let's clear up what this was. A bed warmer was quite simply a handled pan filled with hot coals, poked delicately under the bed covers before sleep. It was both a tool and a pre-sleep ritual, a kind of cozy, smouldering tuck-in. A well-placed bed warmer brought a grateful sigh on a winter's night. For those living in drafty cabins where the wind found its way through knothole and creaky board, this little device was a badge of civilization. Night after night, folks took this cautious pan of heat, slid it between the linen layers, and gently warmed the icy sheets, trying, of course, not to set the bed on fire. Accidental singeing happened more often than anyone likes to admit, which is why bed warmers were often made of brass, copper, or pewter. Not because they were fancy, but so they wouldn't turn into impromptu bonfires. In fact, if you listen closely in an 1870s rooming house, you might have heard the creak of floorboards and the soft swish of flannel as Ma or the hired girl murmured, "Don't scoot too far left. Left's a bit scorched from last week." Now, if you didn't own a proper bed warmer, and many didn't, you improvised. Heated bricks from the hearth were surprisingly effective. Wrap one in a towel, place it by your toes, and presto, medieval foot spa. Sure, by morning it cooled into something resembling a loaf of sorrow. But when dropped into a cold bed at 11 p.m., that brick might as well have been made of sunbeams. Then there were soapstone warmers, smooth, ponderous hunks that held heat like a mule holds a grudge. Soapstone's popularity wasn't limited to beds either. It snuck its way into sleighs, footrests, and long wagon rides. People even named them sometimes. Warmth was precious. Sentimentality naturally followed. Equally important in the nocturnal warmth toolkit was the woolen hot water bottle, aka Grandma's knitted flask blanket. While rubber hot water bottles didn't become widespread until later in the 19th century, people still filled glass or metal bottles with heated water, tucked them into socks or shawls, and hoped for the best. One had to fall asleep quickly though, before the bottle's heat turned tepid, giving off all the comfy charm of a damp slipper. Of course, nothing compares to the natural heating system known as another human. Sharing a bed in the Wild West wasn't just common. It was practically census policy. Siblings, friends, strangers, whoever was passing through, all slid under the same buffalo hide throw. Privacy might have been a lost concept, but body heat was worth every awkward elbow jab. On the chillier frontiers, even rooms doubled as hybrid spaces for people, livestock, and the occasional chicken named Harriet. A shared roof meant shared heat. Horses snorted in corners, goats muttered rude thoughts in their sleep, and Harriet, perched smugly on a beam, supervised it all with judgmental poultry quiet. And it wasn't just animals playing a role in this strange ballet of warmth. Rugs, cloaks, wool coats, anything with fluff or thickness, became vital insulation. Colourful patchwork quilts sprawled like sleepy mosaics across feather beds, stitched by hands that understood winter down to their bones. Each thread-bound square told a story of a worn apron, a wedding shirt, or a curtain once fine but now committed to cozier causes. We mustn't forget the famed buffalo robe either, a vast, heavy blanket made from, yes, you guessed it, the hide of a buffalo, with the fur still attached for proper insulation. Not only did it warm people at night, it raised some interesting philosophical questions about how many people could fit under one oversized, slightly gamey, gloriously soft wrap. Families took turns like it was a prized heirloom and a personal cuddle contest. After the embers faded in the hearth and the last mug of sarsaparilla was drained, folks would settle in with bricks, bottles, blankets, and buffalo. They'd pull hats down over their ears, mutter hopeful things about surviving until spring, and drift to sleep in their creaking, horse-smelling rooms, feeling, all things considered, rather snug. And out there, beyond the flicker of lantern light, winter pressed its cold face against the window, listening. In the stillness of that hush, there's another story to tell, about the dreams that rode through those long western nights, and what people saw when they closed their eyes under all that patchwork warmth. In the drowsy lull of a wind-swept western night, as coyotes crooned lullabies to the moon and the prairie sighed under a quilt of stars, one question lingered as stubbornly as creaky floorboards in an old saloon. How, oh how, did cowboys manage to keep their toes from turning into popsicles before central heating swaggered into town? The secret, it turns out, had layers. Literally. Let's begin with the undergarments, an underrated hero of thermal warfare. Back then, men wore long johns made of wool or flannel, which had the uncanny ability to itch and insulate all at once. Wool, you'll recall, is basically a sheep's built-in survival blanket. So if you ever find yourself shivering in a 10-gallon hat and wondering what to wear, simply think, what would a sheep do? Over those itchy essentials came shirts, often as thick as saddle leather and about as breathable as a closed mine shaft. Work shirts were made of sturdy cotton or wool flannel, with sleeves rolled down to fend off cold and keep elbows from freezing mid-horseshoe pitch. The idea was simple. Stack enough layers and you could survive practically anything, from a prairie blizzard to a poker game gone cold. Then we have outerwear. The duster coat, an iconic piece of cowboy armor, wasn't made for style, though it certainly made many a silhouette look sinister and mysterious, capital S and M. These coats were long, sometimes nearly ankle length, and made of oilskin or canvas treated with wax or linseed oil. It repelled rain, warded off snow, politely declined sleet, and was apparently strong enough to withstand a stampede of confused geese. But of course, no amount of wool and wax could entirely keep out the creeping chill of a Dakota midnight. So what did the cowboys do then? They got inventive. Before the electric blanket wrapped sleepy folks in humming warmth, there existed something much lumpier, the buffalo robe. Thick, smelly, and splendidly warm, buffalo hides were prized for their insulating powers. People didn't just use them to sleep. They draped them over wagon seats, wrapped themselves in them during sleet storms, and quite possibly used them to avoid unwanted conversation. Crawling under a buffalo robe was akin to entering a prehistoric fortress of fuzz. The downside: if the robe got wet, it began to smell like an argument between a landfill and a livestock market. But warm? Oh, profoundly. Some settlers swore by soapstone bed warmers. Soapstone, when heated in a fire or stove, retained warmth for hours, like a loyal but blistering friend. Wrapped in flannel and tucked under blankets, a hot stone could transform a bed from "why did I bother surviving today" into "I shall never leave this cocoon again." Others heated bricks or iron skillets for a similar effect. That these objects were occasionally forgotten and led to scorched mattresses or singed toes may have gone unreported, mainly because pride is stronger than common sense. Now, of course, we mustn't forget communal sleeping. In the true spirit of misery-loving company, families often slept in one bed during deep winter. Not from affection, although many were fond of each other, but out of plain biological survival. Multiple body temperatures meant less chance of freezing, more chance of someone kicking you in the ribs at 3 a.m. because Grandpa was hogging the hot stone again. Out in cattle camps, life got icier still. Cowboys slept in bedrolls, often with canvas exteriors and wool interiors. These cowboy burritos, as no one then called them, were unrolled carefully on the least damp patch of prairie available. A fire would be built nearby, often guarded jealously from wind and sleepwalkers. The trick was to pile up the coals just before bedding down, then burrow into the roll like a squirrel with performance anxiety. If a hot cup of coffee or blackstrap molasses didn't keep you warm, then sheer contrariness probably did. And then there was cow heat. Yes, you heard that right. When temperatures dipped dangerously low, pens of livestock doubled as radiators. Huddling near a herd of cattle might not win any awards for aroma, but it could provide a degree of warmth, assuming, of course, that the cattle didn't object or sit on you. Night after night, through howling wind and rattling wood cabins, the people of the Wild West persisted, not necessarily because they were brave, but because a hot stone, a buffalo hide, and 3 kids in the same bed were often the only thing keeping frostbite at bay. And as stars flickered overhead like sleepy candle wicks, the cold world outside narrowed to a smouldering fire, the rustle of canvas and the sighs of those trying to dream well beyond winter's reach. Soon, we'll take a closer look at what truly fueled those night fires, the messy, smoky magic of early heating methods. Along the crackling frontier trails and chimney-side towns of the Wild West, as stars twinkled over prairie grass and coyote lullabies stirred the stillness, there unwound a quiet, unsung chronicle of long underwear. Yes, dear listener, tonight we descend delicately into the woolen layers of Western domesticity, into the hushed and buttoned world of nighttime undergarments. For when the sun dipped behind the hills and the fire dwindled to embers, cowboys, schoolmarms, and saloon pianists alike found solace not only in hearths and buffalo pelts, but also in that humble fashion marvel, union suits. Now, Imagine a garment engineered by equal parts desperation and virtue, neck to ankle, stitched from wool or sometimes a scandalous cotton blend. The Union suit debuted in the mid-1800s, originally worn by women seeking rational dress reform. But soon enough, men took one look at this entire body thermos of comfort and said, in so many words, "We will be having that." Some even claimed that if you wore one long enough, it simply became part of your personality. Legends abound of cowhands who wore the same suit all winter without ever removing it, for fear of frostbite, or finding out what smells had grown curious down below. As for frontier construction quality, these were not your modern, polite base layers. Early Union suits often had a flap in the rear, charmingly, if rather indelicately, called the access hatch, drop seat, or the ever-iconic back door. Western folks, being both practical and unsentimental, paid no mind to the implications. When nature called on the prairie, it rarely sent a formal invitation. These suits weren't merely sleeping gear, but daywear, workwear, and on occasion, funeral attire. There are archived letters from traveling ministers complaining gently but firmly about entire congregations dressed in nothing but their woolen onesies under dusty coats and hats. One imagines Sunday service resembling a slumber party, held at high noon, with everyone pretending otherwise. But Union suits were only the first line of defense. Many homes, especially farther from civilization, where the nearest firewood pile was guarded by 3 feet of snow and several surly raccoons, had to get creative. Enter heated bricks. Before heated blankets or electric throws, the brick method ruled supreme. Folks would set bricks in the hearth or directly inside the cook stove oven, allow them to soak up heat like sleepy sponges, then tuck them into the foot of the bed, wrapped in cloth, like oddly dense kittens. The effectiveness, remarkable. The downside, occasionally singed toes, or a surprise awakening when someone forgot to wrap their bed brick in enough gingham. And for those even more flame-averse, there was the boiled potato, not to eat. No, this potato's destiny was nobler. Boiled, wrapped, and settled under quilts, it could radiate gentle warmth for much of the night. In the morning, if still edible and not squished, it might become breakfast. Sustainability meets Snuggle. Meanwhile, the architecture of the Western home did what it could to preserve warmth, despite often being built at the speed and precision of a stampede. Many cabins were chinked with clay or mud to keep the wind at bay, but that didn't always stop it. Family stories tell of how a strong prairie gust could slip through the cracks and extinguish candles, hats, and tempers in one chilly whoosh. One method for beating the draft: hanging tapestries or old quilts on walls inside the house. These textile barriers were not merely decorative, though one could always enjoy rereading Great Aunt Mabel's hand-stitched epic about a chicken's disappointing journey to Kansas City. They added vital insulation where logs and dreams alone weren't quite enough. And for the truly bold, or perhaps the truly forgetful, there were shared beds. In colder months, no one cared who snored or who hogged covers. 3, 4, even 5 people might pack into one mattress like logs in the fireplace. Friends, cousins, neighbors. As long as you didn't mind foot-to-face proximity and a general soup of uncleared hat hair, it was a pragmatic arrangement. Even the fanciest boarding houses knew: warmth first, privacy later. Outside, frost rimed the window panes in delicate ghostly lace. Coyotes yipped across distant hills, and the stars pressed close, keeping their quiet watch. Inside, beneath 7 layers of quilts, nestled against a brick, a potato, or an inappropriately warm cousin, the West slept. And sleep, as any dusty cowboy or schoolteacher might have told you, was more than just a nightly ritual. It was resistance. Resistance against the cold, the winds, and the impolite idea that one needs central heating to dream. Now, let's gently roll over, fluff our imaginary pillows, and prepare to drift deeper into the bedrolls and boarding houses of the past, where dreams rustle as softly as straw-filled mattresses. Imagine a January evening on the open range. Long shadows stretch across snow-dusted plains, the wind whistling tunes only coyote poets seem to understand. The sun has dipped behind the foothills, leaving behind just enough glow to call it romantic, if you ignored the frostbite nipping at your nose. In a world before thermostats or heated blankets that plug into the wall, one could not simply toss a wool sock aside and whisper, "I'll deal with it in the morning." No, sir. Getting through the night was a tactical operation, part physics, part folklore, and part sheer stubbornness. By now, folks on the frontier had gotten creative. One curious method of evening comfort was referred to, cheerfully, as the hot rock trick. Frontier families or solo prospectors would toss smooth river stones into a fire until they glowed with a sullen, reddish defiance. Once these rocks resembled miniature suns, they'd roll them into metal boxes, wrap them in cloth, or tuck them inside sturdy crocks, and then peel back the quilts and slip them into bed like a pre-industrial teddy bear of geological persuasion. Care was essential. There are, in fact, documented cases where an overzealous rock-to-bedding arrangement ended with a smouldering pillow, or, in one unfortunate tale, a fully scorched nightshirt. But mostly, the system worked, and it had the added benefit of giving a person something warm and reliable to hang on to during the cold, unfeeling confusion of mid-December. Sort of like a hug, but rockier. Then there was the straw tick, a mattress innovation so rustic it would make modern chiropractors wake up in a cold sweat. Crafted by stuffing a heavy sheet of fabric with dried straw, this makeshift bedding was affordable, replaceable, and riddled with sound effects. As a person turned over in bed, the straw tick would answer like a barn owl with indigestion. Loud, rustling, and unapologetic. Despite the noise, it insulated bodies remarkably well. Straw is, after all, a dry cousin of insulation batting. Over time, the straw would compress and go limp, needing seasonal fluffing or replacement, which was undertaken with the sort of domestic seriousness usually reserved for spring cleaning or pie baking. Out on the trails, cowboys relied on bedrolls, which were less of a luxury item and more of a fabric burrito for humankind. Layered with wool blankets, weathered canvas, and a curious amount of optimism, the bedroll could be unfurled around a campfire and was often curled up with like a particularly scratchy partner. Cowboys would position themselves just close enough to the fire to feel the warmth, while far enough away to not accidentally roast their spurs. And then there were flannel nightshirts. Fashionable, debatable, functional, actually. These wool blend or cotton nighties were cut generously, often down to the knees or calves, and they swirled in the candlelight like the ghosts of sleepovers past. Early Westerners valued their nightshirts not just for sleep, but for lounging near stoves, chasing raccoons off porches, or answering serious midnight questions like, "What's that noise outside the barn?" Of course, for those with a bit more means, or just a coincidental abundance of iron and labor, there existed the indulgent charm of the Franklin stove. Invented back in the 18th century, but embraced in later decades by anyone who dreamed of a fire that didn't actually burn the house down, The Franklin stove radiated heat efficiently and with decorum. These were not your crackling, bawdy hearth fires. They were tidy, respectable little furnaces that kept toes warm and coffee warmish. Perhaps most charming of all was how people used each other. Yes, before the era of electric blankets and heated mattress pads, warmth was a cooperative sport. Whole families would nest like squirrels in winter, clustering under mountains of quilts, each person adding their share of body heat to the communal pile. Stories would be whispered, jokes told, maybe a hymn half sung before drifting into the kind of slumber only available when sandwiched between your cousin Eustace and a flannel-draped grandmother who smelled vaguely of cinnamon and mule ointment. It was warmth born of ingenuity, stubbornness, and closeness, woven together in a tapestry of ember-heated wishful thinking. And with all that warmth still lingering in your thoughts, like the last glow of a fire before sleep, we turn gently to a subtler piece of the puzzle. Just what role did sleepwear and modesty play beneath those mountain-high stacks of blankets? Let's gently tiptoe into that cozy curiosity next. The moon floated lazily above the plains, casting silver puddles on the parched soil and flickering windows of clappered homes. Somewhere off in the distance, a coyote yawned, possibly from hunger, possibly from sheer existential boredom. It was 1 in the morning, the hour when even ghosts start to wrap things up for the night. Inside a chilled Wyoming homestead, a stovepipe gave off its final, dignified clink as the iron cooled ever so grudgingly. The fire had dwindled to a small democracy of embers debating whether they'd try to reignite or just call it a day. The family lying beneath layers upon layers, not of plush duvets, but mostly of Grandma's unimpressed quilts and retired flour sacks, had long since mastered the strategy known to frontier folk as clinging together like terrified penguins in a snow globe. Now, heating one's sleeping quarters without electricity, faltering gas lines, or a single hint of central anything might sound like a rustic nightmare to us today. But to those stalwart pioneers of the Wild West, it was simply called Tuesday. Among the more creative solutions to bedtime chilliness was the hot soapstone. Picture this: a smooth chunk of stone heated all day in the belly of a wood-burning stove until it developed the internal temperature of a small, angry volcano. Then, gingerly wrapped in a rag or thick sock, it would be chaperoned up to bed like an awkward teenager at his first barn dance. Slipped down by the feet, it radiated a sort of passive-aggressive warmth, never quite as cozy as advertised, but certainly better than a bare ice bed. Many folks swore by it, others swore at it, particularly when it shifted in the night and scorched a shin. In the absence of plenty, people made do. Dried corn cobs wrapped in flannel made suspect but serviceable hand warmers. Some used bricks baked in ovens, though the danger of fire always loomed. Frontier sleeping often walked a tightrope between freezing to death and spontaneous immolation. Chimneys, for instance, did not come with instructions. They smoked freely, like unrepentant gamblers, and creaked dramatically in the night, which made dreams of Dickensian ghosts or collapsing flues a nightly affair. Still, perhaps the most underestimated source of heat was the mighty feather bed, a great, puffy continent of down and stubborn cotton ticking. Essentially a softly dangerous trap. Once sunk in, there was no hope of escape until morning. As if comforted by the sardonic embrace of a fluffy marsh, many pioneer sleepers would vanish from stress and consciousness the moment they descended into its warm and possibly allergenic depths. Not that livestock was to be outdone by stone and stuffing. In barns across the West, cows, horses, and sheep outperformed most available insulation. Many a family chose to sleep above the animals, either in haylofts or semi-enclosed upper rooms, thus enjoying the gentle warmth wafting up like a slow, fragrant soup. The scent of livestock might not appeal to modern noses, but in those days, the aroma of warm cattle was fondly referred to as currency-neutral comfort. Although, understandably, this name never caught on in perfumery, one can't underestimate the role of fashion in surviving frontier nights either. Woolen long johns, what some called onesies for the severely committed, were rarely removed between Thanksgiving and Easter. Removing them prematurely was seen as boldly optimistic or just plain reckless. Nightcaps may sound quaint, but they served both purpose and personality, preserving heat and dignity amid the nightly freeze. And yes, more than a few sleep-hardened cowboys believed in warming their boots by the fire and then sleeping with those toasty boots tucked under their blankets like reluctant bedfellows. Of course, humor helped too. Jokes were warmth for the soul, even when the toes had gone mercifully numb. A favorite prairie saying went, "It's so cold. Even the lies freeze before they hit the ground." This type of weather-induced wit helped folks feel a little less like meat cycles awaiting the morning thaw. But the Wild West didn't just survive nights like these. It developed a particular kind of folk resilience, resourceful, odd, and sometimes slightly dangerous. Staying warm was less about comfort and more about sheer grit disguised as family tradition. As another gust of wind whispered across the moonlit prairie, the frost rimmed the window panes like spun sugar. Inside, beneath patched layers and sleeping pets, with a baked potato or a heated rock tucked loyally under the covers, dreamers drifted away, perhaps imagining a future where bedrooms came with magical vents that blew warmth on demand. But before that age would come along with its thermostats and tangled extension cords, one last unsung hero, perhaps the most peculiar of all, would take its turn keeping sleepers warm. If you had wandered into a frontier saloon in the late 1800s, say, after sundown, when the prairie grew as quiet as a dozing dog, you'd have found it not only full of characters, but also surprisingly warm. And not just warm with whiskey and bad card hands, but physically warm, toasty even. Which is saying something, considering the walls were usually draftier than a politician in campaign season. You see, when it came to warmth in the Old West, people were nothing if not inventively stubborn, especially in public spaces like saloons, general stores, and stagecoach stops, places where both gossip and body heat were expected to circulate freely. Most joint establishments relied on the mighty wood stove, cast iron behemoths that looked like a cannon mated with a soup pot and then dressed up for Sunday service. These stoves were sacred. They sat in the center of the room like the hearth gods of ancient times. Folks clustered around them, coats open like unfolding newspapers, chins tilted down like birds roosting in a circle. Stoking the fire was a kind of ritual. The barkeep, or sometimes a designated fireman, not to be confused with actual firemen, would feed the stove logs with the reverence of a priest offering incense. Too little wood and you'd lose your customers to frostbite. Too much and someone would pass out from the heat and dram combined. Now, wood was the gold standard, but not everyone had a forest conveniently growing out back. In treeless stretches like the Great Plains, settlers discovered something, shall we say, unconventional. Buffalo chips. Yes, those were what you're thinking. Dried bison droppings. They cured flat, like nature's misguided attempt at biscuits. Lightweight, plentiful, and oddly flammable. They were prized for their heating properties, And while they did give off a certain earthy aroma, locals swore you got used to it. Eventually, in some forward-leaning towns, if you could call any frontier settlement forward-leaning without being accused of backy snobbery, coal was shipped in by rail. Coal burned hotter and longer than wood or buffalo chips, but came with a risk, namely explosions. Industrial stoves had a bad habit of misbehaving, and when coal dust hung in the air just right, a single ember could turn a cozy saloon into a very loud, fast-moving open-air patio. But even with all that effort, public warmth didn't just come from fire. It came from people. Huddled shoulder to shoulder, cowboys, outlaws, and wayfarers built up a microclimate of shared humanity and sweat. They told stories long into the night, their boots steaming as snow melted from their spurs. They passed around tin cups of questionable coffee and laughed too hard at jokes that probably weren't very good. You stayed toasty simply by being there. Interestingly, some saloons turned heating into a kind of luxury gimmick. One enterprising barkeep in Colorado installed copper pipes beneath the floorboards, an unofficial precursor to radiant floor heating. He filled them with hot water from a constantly boiling cauldron out back, which sounds clever, until you consider how often those pipes froze, exploded, or leaked into the poker table. There were even rumors, possibly exaggerated, of pianos with stove flues running through them, warming both the air and the cords. So if you ever wondered why Maple Leaf Rag had a kind of smoky undertone, now you have your answer. And then there was the human stove. Old Elmer Jenkins. No fireplace, no coals, just Elmer. He was a rotund man who sat in the corner of the saloon each evening, wrapped in 5 wool blankets. Patrons paid him a nickel to sit beside him and borrow some Elmer heat. It was said that on particularly cold nights, Elmer made more money than the piano player and bartender combined. So the next time you feel the central heating hum beneath your floorboards and the tea kettle softly sighing on the stove, remember the Westerners, buffalo chip burners, stove whisperers, and snuggle entrepreneurs like our dear Elmer, who survived winters with nothing but grit, coal smoke, and a slightly too literal sense of community. And as the stars high above the prairie flickered like match heads reluctant to spark, another quiet night curled gently across the land. But what about the travelers who slept not in towns or near stoves at all, but out on the wide open trail? That's a chillier tale for another moment. Let's snuggle in a little deeper and drift that direction next. By the time the stars had blinked fully open across the cold western sky, the frontier towns had settled into their nightly hush. Fonts of flickering amber from hearths and oil lamps spilled out onto wooden porches, while chimney smoke lazily uncurled upward like the sigh of a tired town. It had been another day of bartering, barn mending, and doing heroic things with only half a cowhide and a biscuit. At night, warmth wasn't a luxury. It was a ritual. You might imagine the Wild West as all gunfights and tumbleweeds, but beneath the bravado and spurs, nightly survival came down to more tender matters, like how best to not freeze one's backside off in the pitch-black prairie silence. Inside a typical frontier cabin, the fire would be stoked one last time before bed, its sleepy crackle whispering lullabies to the weary. A pot of beans might still be warm on the edge of the hearth, slowly hardening into a midnight snack no one wanted, but everyone would eat. The last candle would be snuffed with a gentle thumb and a quick, practiced squish between dampened fingers, lest it ignite the entire homestead in one smoky blaze of poor planning. As the fire settled into a glowing orange shrug, folks swaddled themselves under layers of quilts, some stitched lovingly by mothers, others cobbled together from old flour sacks and the coats of sheep that no longer needed them. Children slept curled like kittens near the fireplace, clustered on pallet beds stuffed with straw and childhood optimism. Back in more remote cabins, some folks kept a bed warmer tucked in foot first, an innocent-looking pan filled with embers, encased in metal, slid carefully between the sheets. Of course, you'd have to shake the sheets beforehand to evict any snakes that thought they had invented the idea of a warm nap spot. Frontier living demanded both savvy and a flexible relationship with fear. Speaking of fire in the bed, have we talked about hot bricks? This ingenious hack involved heating bricks in the hearth until they were good and toasty, then wrapping them in cloth and slipping them under the covers. It wasn't flashy, but it beat spooning a goat, logistically and emotionally. Plus, a well-wrapped brick had the courtesy not to wander off during the night or chew cud. Another time-tested trick for cozying up was sleeping 4 or 5 to a bed. Not because family values demanded it, but because hypothermia lacked sentiment. It was warm, awkward, and often musical, if you counted snoring as a harmony. Parents, kids, and occasionally the house cat arranged themselves like human puzzle pieces, layered so tactfully that no one wanted to move for fear of inviting back the chill. And the first soul to dare leave the bed in the morning risked an ambush of cold worthy of a Dickens funeral. Even cowboys, sleeping out under skies so clear the stars looked close enough to lasso, had their methods. They would roll up in heavy wool blankets, called bedrolls, and more often than not, sleep next to their horse, who, while lacking conversational charm, gave off decent body heat and rarely hogged the covers. They'd position themselves with the wind at their back, and a fire low enough to not alert the local wildlife, or worse, rival cowhands with a talent for ghost stories. And somewhere in all of that stillness, drifting above the low whistle of prairie wind and the occasional snore of an overworked rancher, there was a quiet pride in outwitting the cold one more time. Not with gadgets or apps or programmable thermostats, but with wit, wool, and a firm belief in the power of a warm pie tin on one's toes. So as the oil lamp burns its last breath and another frontier night gives way to soft dawn light, sneaking through crooked window panes, we leave behind the flannel-wrapped heroes of a time before wires and switches. They did not merely survive the night, they tamed it, with layered socks, lumber smoke, and a level of scrappiness we can only admire as we complain about our room being 72 instead of 74. Tonight, let the thought of a warm brick under homespun quilts guide you to sleep. The wind is quiet now, the fire's gone to embers, and the stars are still watching. Wherever you are, perhaps in a big city bedroom or tucked away in a cabin of your own, remember, coziness isn't about central heating. It's about knowing how to welcome the night and keep it company. Well, partner, we've come to the end of our trail this evening. Let the prairie wind sing you its lullaby. Close your eyes, settle in under whatever quilt life's handed you, and drift off like a cowboy under the stars, warm, wild, and wonderfully asleep.